Grace and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Tonight we're in Hebrews chapter 11. We're doing the second half of Hebrews 11. Last week we did the first half, verses 1 to 21, and this week we are looking at 22 to 40. Now, if you remember last week, we talked about how verses 1 to 3 are kind of you could almost call it a thesis statement, a kind of heading statement describing the nature of faith. And faith is the sort of thing that is directed, that is about an objective reality. It's assurance of things that we can't see. We can't empirically test them. We can't empirically manage them. We trust or we believe in unseen things. And faith has the kind of quality to it that is the assurance of those unseen things. Now, in Hebrews 11, the unseen things are not only the heavenly realities, like the heavenly tabernacle, that we've been talking about in chapter 8, 9, 10. But it's primarily in Hebrews 11, the unseen thing is the unfulfilled promise. And faith is the assurance that God will keep God's promises. It's the assurance that God will act to bring something out of nothing, that God will act to bring the reality into being, or that we will actually inherit what we cannot yet see. We don't see it right now, but faith is the assurance that it's there. It's not a matter of uncertainty, it's a matter of assurance, right? Just as God created the world out of nothing, God created what we see out of what we don't see. And in the same way, we are walking through the wilderness of life. We're on our pilgrimage. We're on our wilderness journey, headed toward something we don't yet see. But because we believe God is the creator and that God can create something out of nothing, certainly God can create that future as well. And we trust that. We trust the God who makes promises and keeps promises. Right? And faith is willing to walk that path. As we said last week, that doesn't mean that we don't have some subjectivity that is, sometimes we doubt, and sometimes we question, and sometimes we're uncertain about things, and we don't know how to figure this out. No, that's part of the faith walk. All the way through Scripture, the faith walk has been exactly that. But the reality that faith is pointed toward, the future orientation of faith, is the objective reality of what God will accomplish in keeping the promise of inheritance. So that was kind of the thesis statement, verses 1 through 3. And then we looked at 7 named individuals. It was Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham, and then it was Jacob and Joseph, and then it was Isaac, Jacob, Isaac, and Joseph. No, it was Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, to get it in the right order there. 7 individuals who had the sort of faith that they didn't have. What they were believing in wasn't in their possession. They didn't have it. But by faith, they believed it was real. And so Abraham was looking for that city. They all were looking for that city that God will inaugurate, that God will erect and build for the people of God, the inheritance. So tonight, we're moving into another section. So we had the 7 names, and now we're moving into a section that says 7 times by faith. It doesn't have 7 names, but 7 times it says by faith. So we got a kind of a 7 and 7 here. And if you look at it as we read it, watch for those by faith, which includes Moses and Moses' parents, Moses, and then it includes the people of Israel who went through the Red Sea, and the people of Israel who surrounded Jericho, and Rahab. Those would be the named individuals that are part of the 7. And then in the last part, we have this kind of through faith. And it is kind of a listing, you might say. But it's a listing that has kind of a structure to it. When you read through it for the first time, maybe that structure doesn't pop out at us. But I think there is a way of thinking about this, that we have this list of names, and then we have this unnamed. The people are not named that he's talking about. And that when he's talking about the names, these are more positive acts of faith. But then the unnamed are more kind of like the endurance of faith. That is suffering. So faith can have moments of triumph, moments of celebration, moments when something gets done. Right? By faith, something happens. But then there are moments when we live by faith, but we live under the specter of death. We live in the midst of hostility. We live in the midst of persecution. We live in poverty. There are negative contexts through which we live by faith. And so I think our preacher is doing both. He's talking about some of those positive aspects, which are primarily associated with the names that he gives, but not only those names. But then he has a whole list of unnamed realities that are more of the negative dimension. And then we have the final verses, 39 and 40, which basically says, okay, this is what we've been talking about. Verses 1 through 3 comes to kind of a conclusion. And we are part of this story. We are part of this story. These great heroes of faith, whatever we might call them, they're not just great past stories. It's an ongoing story. And we're part of that story. And these heroes will not find their fullness. They won't find their perfection. They won't find their full inheritance until we do it with them together. So, in one sense, we are the continuing story upon which the past is dependent. And looking forward, you got to keep going, because we will be perfected with you, not without you. So that's why you got to keep going. So we bear witness to faith, and you keep going. So with that in mind, let's read the text. Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to begin at verse 23. By faith, Moses was hidden by his parents for 3 months after his birth, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called a son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered abuse suffered for the Messiah to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to the reward. By faith, he left Egypt, unafraid of the king's anger, for he persevered, unafraid of the king's anger, as though he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as if it were dry land, but when the Egyptians attempted to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab, the prostitute, did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had received the spies in peace. And what more should I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouth of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead by resurrection. Others, the unnamed, others were tortured, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned to death. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, persecuted, tormented, of which the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground. Yet all these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better, so that they would not, apart from us, be made perfect. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Wow, that's a powerful testimony. And of course, the assumption is you're supposed to know all these stories, right? That's the assumption, that you know who we're talking about. Even those that are not named, that you have some idea of who they are, or you've heard those stories, whether you heard them in synagogue, or you heard them in Hebrew school, or you heard them in the preaching, or whatever it was. You know something of this story. So let's take it in three pieces here. But notice this verses 39 and 40. Notice the future orientation of faith here. They were commended for their faith. Did they get what they were promised? No, they did not receive the promise. They did not receive what was promised. Since God had, no promise, no reception, let's put it that way. No reception of the promise. They didn't receive it because there's something better out here that everyone will receive together. Us, everyone. What's the better? Right? It's that inheritance. The language of Hebrews and other places talking about the inheritance, an eternal inheritance, and a participation in the heavenly reality, a participation in the fullness of God's presence. That's the better country, right? The city of the living God, whose builder and maker is God, whose builder and architect is God. So the better is not a better life here, although that could be true. The better is about the eternal inheritance. That's the primary promise in mind here. You notice the line did say that some people did obtain promises, right? In verse 33. Some obtained promises. Like Abraham got the promise of a child. He got that promise. Moses experienced, or Israel experienced liberation from Egyptian slavery. That's obtaining a promise. Right? So there are promises that are experienced as fulfilled, but the main promise, the goal, where we're headed, what's the whole journey through the wilderness, the whole pilgrimage we're on is about that eternal inheritance. And in 2 weeks, we'll talk about that a lot more, because that's where Hebrews 12 takes us to talk about what are you talking about, a better country? What is that? What is the better country? What is that better promise? Well, Hebrews 12 will tell us what it is, but we're not quite there yet. All right, let's look at Moses to start with. How do look at each of those by faith statements. There's 4 of them. By faith, Moses' parents. By faith, Moses. Think about how in each of those there is a kind of future orientation. There's something about the future. And there's also seems to be something about the hostile situation. Hostile situation in which. Let's take that first line. Verse 23. What's the hostility in verse 23? Yeah, we're talking about genocide, right? We're going to kill the babies, all the male babies. What's the future orientation? How did they have faith in the future? How did they have faith in a promise? What happened that expressed that faith by faith? Okay, they defied the king, the Pharaoh, and they put the baby in a basket, and they put him on the water, and said, okay, God, you're going to have to handle this, because we can't protect this baby from Pharaoh's army. So the faith is in a future for Moses. Moses has a future, but it's in a hostile context. Right? Faith in the midst of hostility. That's what the audience is experiencing, right? The original hearers of this sermon, that's what they're experiencing. They're experiencing persecution, social alienation. They're hated by the community. They're being pressured to conform to social norms. I mean, those kinds of pressures, we can understand that. Maybe we don't understand them as well in our culture. But if you're living in another culture, like a Chinese culture or a Pakistani culture, or those social pressures to conform to non-Christian values, right? And of course, we have social pressures of the similar sort here as well. Maybe not as radical as some of those other situations. Yeah.
Talking about the preparing a place for us.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier, he talked about preparing a place for them too. Then here he said we'll all be together.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Abraham was looking for that city whose builder and maker is God, right? And that's that better place, right? So yeah, and we're gonna get there together, right? It's kind of like we're all gonna experience this at one time, but everybody's waiting, and we have to live by faith, persevere. Look at the second one. How's the verse 24? How is the future and the hostility represented there? 24 to 26, actually. What's the hostility? That's pretty obvious there, isn't it? I'm sorry? Yeah. Yeah, harsh treatment, yeah, abuse. He considered abuse suffered for the Messiah. Now, to say Messiah means something future oriented, right? So he's suffering for something future. And took poverty as more important than wealth, or being identified with Israel, the slaves, being identified with the slaves is more important than being identified with royalty, which created suffering for him. And he was abused. And he chose, notice verse 25, he chose to share ill treatment with the people of God. Think about what happened back in chapter 2. When, and Jeff quoted it on Sunday in chapter 2, but we see Jesus made a little lower than the angels, right? And Kristen talked about this in her sermon. What did he choose to do? He chose to share our weaknesses. He chose to share death with us. He chose to come and become human and share our human existence in all of its negativity, right? Even to death. Well, what did Moses choose to do? For the sake of the Messiah, for the sake of that future, he chose to share the life of Israel in Egyptian slavery. Because he was looking, verse 26, there's the future orientation again. He was looking ahead to the reward. Now, you notice how expansive Abraham and Moses get the most attention. And Moses gets a lot of attention here because Moses already mentioned back in chapter 3 that Moses was the servant in God's house. The son is the servant over the house, the son over the house. But Moses was a servant in the house. So we've already had a Moses-Jesus comparison back in chapter 3. And here, you really get to see how Moses anticipates the Messiah by his own choices. Instead of being a king, takes on poverty, right? Instead of the pleasures of glory, I mean, Moses here is pleasures of sin, but instead of self gratification, he chooses to be abused, to share in the suffering, right? So there's a real comparison here. And the whole point of it is to say, look, you're not the first people who've had a hard time. You're not alone. Moses had a hard time. You know how great Moses was, but he had a hard time. But he persevered by faith. He chose by faith. He kept going. And Jesus is also one who also had a hard time, right? And he became perfect by the things which he suffered. Look at verse 27. We get another by faith statement. So what's the negativity here? What's the hostility in verse 27?
Fear of the king.
Yeah, the anger of the king. Yeah, exactly. And what's the future?
He saw who was invisible.
Yeah, it's about the thing you can't see, right? I can't see this God, but I'm going to trust in him. I've seen him in some way, like at the burning bush. I think that's the illusion here, that he saw him at the burning bush kind of thing. But hadn't seen the fullness, hadn't seen the reward, hadn't seen, he's going to be commissioned to liberate Israel from Egypt, but he doesn't know how that's going to happen. So it's a future orientation. Verse 28. What's the hostility and what's the future orientation?
Destroyer of the firstborn.
Yeah, I mean, there's death is a part of this picture, right? And so we're going to escape death by the sprinkling of the blood. But the future is escaping death, right? I'm going to sprinkle blood. Is that going to keep us alive? Well, we'll have to trust by faith. By faith, we'll sprinkle the blood and believe in the future that God has for us. Yeah.
You got me to work something out in my feeble old mind. You know, I see here Moses passing when he's coming down off the mountain,
Mm-hmm.
and he got angry with these people, and he told God, said, God, if they won't listen to me, take me out of the book of life.
Yeah.
Paul in Romans said the same thing. And if these people will not hear me,
Mm-hmm.
take me out of the book of life too.
Yeah.
I think I could see a passion if they had.
Mm.
They really want any people.
Yeah, I don't know if that's specifically here, but yeah, I mean, certainly that's part of the story. And when we're talking about Moses here, he's naming some specific things, but I think there's also this, hey, remember Moses. You know, there's this general thing too. Remember Moses. I'm going to tell you a few things, but it's a bigger picture than that. It's a bigger story than that. Yeah. All right, let's go down to verse 29 and 31. By faith. Think about what the hostility is and what the future is in verse 29. Pass through the Red Sea. Now that's a little courage there to step into that, right? Because you don't know if that's going to hold. So that by faith, you stepped into that threatening environment. And you had the threatening environment of Egyptians on your tail. Right? And the hope was the future of escape, getting on the other side and being free from the hostility that was pursuing you. Verse 30, future and hostility. Remember, faith is oriented to the future. At least in Hebrews 11, that's the primary emphasis. You got these walls of Jericho, which were seemingly insurmountable. A huge barrier. And by faith, they walked around Jericho and the walls fell. Now, when you're walking around Jericho and you're blowing your trumpets and all that, got to remember whenever you learn that story somewhere along the way. And if you haven't, go read Joshua 4, 5, 6. Can you imagine walking around that and saying, yeah, this thing's going to fall on the seventh time. we got to do it 7 times, So we're on number 5. But you're hoping, you're expecting, by faith, you're looking toward the future. That's something that God is going to do an act of deliverance here. And that's what faith is, that sort of journey. We're expecting and waiting and seeking for God to act in terms of deliverance. And then Rahab. Other than Sarah, this is the only woman mentioned. And Sarah has been mentioned in relationship to Abraham and having children. But Rahab is the only woman mentioned, and also the only, what else could we say about that? The only what? Well, the only prostitute mentioned. That would be true too. The only Gentile mentioned, right? So she's a very unique case, which tells us that God's goal in Canaan was not to kill all the Canaanites. He wanted to win them. That was part of the goal. He didn't, if God said kill all the Canaanites, Rahab should have gone down. But that was not really what that conquest was about. But anyway, in Rahab, we have, let's say an unhealthy profession, right? A woman in an ancient culture, and a Gentile, a Canaanite. By faith. She had faith. And she had a hostile situation herself, didn't she? What did she have to do? What did she do? Yeah, she put that scarlet on the outside, say, this is my house, trusting in the word of the spies. She hid the spies, right? Did and received them in peace, rather than, which put her in trouble with everybody else. So she was embracing the hostility, or she was experiencing the potential hostility and believing in the future. Right? So you see how this future and hostility kind of are the themes that work their way through here, which is exactly what this audience, this church needs to hear. They need to understand that hostile situation is not unique, it's not new, and you can live through it. You can persevere. You can make it. Others have made it too. And that's when we get the others, right? Verse 32, and what more should I say? That sounds like a sermon, doesn't it? I could keep going. Hear preachers say something like that. I could talk about this a long time. What else should I say? I could talk about a lot more. I could name this person, and the people he names here are 5 of them really come from the time of the judges: Gideon, Barak, Samson. I know sometimes you might call him Barak. Okay, that's the Mississippi pronunciation, Barak. But Hebrew would be Barak. Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. Now that covers, when you get the prophets in, that means you're kind of like, and the rest of Israel's history, So it's kind of covering the big picture, but it's focused on those early years, the years before the monarchy, except for, David is an overlap there. And this is not when you look at that list, it's not necessarily a Hall of Fame list. All right. I mean, you think about Gideon. Did Gideon have a problem? Yeah, we in fact have a verb that describes what he did. He fleeced God, He made God put up or shut up, And then Barak, did he have a problem? Yeah, he wouldn't go without Deborah going with him. He didn't have enough faith to get out there on his own. He wanted Deborah to go with him. But others through faith. I mean, Gideon still had faith, even though it wasn't perfect. And Barak had faith, even though it wasn't perfect. And then Samson, oh my word, when you think about Samson, what is the good thing you can say? That he killed himself pushing down the temple, But by faith, Samson conquered armies. Right? We'll see what these people did in just a moment. But then Jephthah is also a tough one. I know Jeff has said a couple of times, why, how can you talk about Jephthah here? I mean, Jephthah seemingly, at least the plain reading of the text, I guess you could say, the natural reading of the text is that he sacrificed his daughter. He killed his daughter because he made that vow that said the first thing comes out of my house, which is seemed like a stupid vow to me. But, first thing comes out of my house, I'm going to. But animals lived in houses. They were a part of the housing. Usually you had a place for animals in the lower parts, and on the first floor of your house. But anyway, so why is Jephthah here? Well, if you go back and read the story of Jephthah, like in Judges 11, there's a point in which it says in Judges 11:29 that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. And Jephthah submitted to it. And Jephthah, by faith, what did he do? He conquered. He defeated armies. Right? He wasn't perfect. We might even say, we don't even want him in the list. Right? Yeah, well, yeah. The daughter had to go mourn for 7 days before that. There are other interpretations of that, but anyway, we don't have time to get into all of that, but you're right. You're right. And David, I mean, David's a flawed character, right? I mean, he's not the perfect guy, king. And Samuel, what about Samuel? God said, you're not going to be, your family, this judge thing is not going to continue after you. Why did he tell that to him? Yeah, because his kids, right? His kids were fooling around with the women and taking bribes. And I mean, they were horrible people, apparently. Right? And so Samuel, not the model for fathers, right? I guess. Right? So every one of these people, we could object to each one and say, well, he doesn't belong in the list. Well, he didn't belong in the list. And we could say that about Jacob. We could say that about Isaac. We could say that about Abraham. We could say that about Noah. Noah got drunk, right, after the flood. So the list is not about perfection of faith. It's not about here is the faith that makes you a perfect person. That's not it. It's the faith that believes in the promises of God, that there's a future, and acts on the trust of that future. I'm going to stick with this because I believe in that future. I believe that future is real. I have assurance that it's real, and I'm going to live in assurance of the reality to come. So if you look at what these guys did, notice what they're known for. They conquered kingdoms. That would be Gideon, Barak, David, Jephthah. Ministered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouth of lions. Now that's not named in this list, right? Although I guess you might say Samson belongs there, but probably Daniel is in view there. Quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. And then we get women. Women are added to the list. They weren't named, but women received their dead by resurrection. Who are we talking about? Yeah, Elisha and Elijah. Yeah, the Shunammite woman. And then the woman up at Tyre, right? Oh, is that right? I'm not remembering that one right. But yeah, women received, their child died, their son died, and they received their son back in resurrection. So what they're known for is not being perfect. What they're known for is persevering, listening to God, acting on faith, leaning into the future that God has promised, despite the hostility that surrounded them. Now, verse 36, we get some more others. Let's get a second set of others here. And these are all sort of negative. I mean, notice in the ones we just read, 34 to 35, all those are kind of positive things. They conquered kingdoms. They got strength out of weakness. They received their dead back from the dead. They put foreign armies to flight. I mean, all those are kind of positive things that faith does, positive acts of faith. But now, the next list, these are not things you want to be a part of. But faith does endure through these things. Faith experiences these things. You persevere through through mocking and flogging. Mocking, think about the hostility of a culture that mocks you, makes fun of you. Flogging, chains and imprisonment. We know some of the people that we're addressing here were in prison. We saw that, we'll see that in chapter 13. So we know this is happening to them, not only to the past, but to them in the present. They were stoned to death. They were sawn in two. The tradition is that Isaiah was sawn in two. That's probably what he's referring to here. They were killed by the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats. Some of the prophets, they were destitute and they dressed in simple ways. Persecuted, tormented. But notice the line in verse 35. Others were tortured, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection. That is a reference to what happened in the book of Maccabees. And I want to read a little bit from the book of Maccabees here. If you have a Bible with an apocrypha, you can read this as well. But this comes from 2 Maccabees, chapter 7. Now, the situation is Antiochus Epiphanes has conquered the land. After Alexander the Great died, it got split up into 4 big kingdoms, and then those kind of fell apart, and now there was a big struggle over who gets to rule Palestine. And the Jews, of course, didn't have any independent status. They didn't have a nation, but it was still about who's going to control what. And Antiochus Epiphanes was from Syria, like Damascus, Syria kind of thing. And he's conquered Palestine. He's conquered Jerusalem. And he has desecrated the temple. He has sacrificed a pig on the altar. He's just mocking them, insulting them, and killing them. And the story here in 2 Maccabees 7 is about 7 sons. And these 7 sons are being tortured and killed in successive order in front of their mother. Their mother is watching their deaths. And it comes to the 7th son. 6 are dead already. And the 7th son, Antiochus, is really displeased with how well these other 6 suffered well, I guess. They died well. They didn't give up their faith. In fact, I'll just focus on the last son. Brings the mother and basically says to the mother, Antiochus says, we want this 7th son to renounce his faith, and I'll let him live. Just give up, and he'll live. And you, Mom, go talk to him, tell him to save his life. And so here's what the text says. This is from 2 Maccabees, chapter 7, and this is verse 26. And after much urging on his part, she undertook to persuade her son. That is, Antiochus is telling, go talk to him, convince him not to keep doing this. But leaning close to him, she spoke in their native language, which would be Aramaic, as follows, so that Antiochus couldn't understand what she was saying. My son, have pity on me. I have carried you 9 months in my womb and nursed you for 3 years, and have reared you and brought you up to this point in your life and have taken care of you. I beg you, my child, to look at the heaven and earth and see everything that is in them, and recognize that God did not make them out of things that existed. That sounds like Hebrews 11:3. And in the same way, the human race came into being. And then she says, do not fear this butcher, but prove worthy of your brothers. Accept death, so that in God's mercy, I may get you back again along with your brothers. That's what the writer of Hebrews is referring to, and that they refused to be released from the torture in order that they might have a resurrection. And that's what the mom is telling. Think about what kind of faith is that? What an amazing kind of faith. And so when our preacher says others through faith, he's thinking about these kind of stories that are just part of the culture, part of well-known stories. I mean, this is like maybe 200 years before Hebrews was written, maybe a little longer than that. But the Maccabean stories of these martyrs, these 7 brothers in particular, but other martyrs too, because there are other places where he may be referencing some of the stories in this list, the persecution and the wars and so on. This is like us talking about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson or something, part of the stories of the culture, part of what binds us together as a nation. We have these stories we tell each other. And this is one of the most famous stories of all, is this mother's word to her son, who did not receive the promise. She didn't get him back in resurrection that day, right? But she's waiting where we together will be made perfect, where together we will all be resurrected, where together we will all inherit the eternal home. And by faith, we persevere, even though we cannot see it, even though we can't touch it. By faith, we accept the future. Yeah.
So is the better that God is going to set things right in the world?
Yeah, I think that's the better here. That's the kind of the eternal kingdom that cannot be shaken, right? Which we get to at the end of chapter 12. So that will be identified for us at the end of chapter 12, what that better is. Yeah.
I think it's tied so much to Romans, Paul talks about that. We as Christians, we're going to be persecuted.
Mm-hmm.
There's no getting around that. But he said, just remember, nothing can separate us from God's love.
Yeah. Yeah. Neither life nor death, neither depth or famine nor sword can separate us from the love of God. Not just persecution, but death itself, or famine, or just any tribulation or trouble or struggle. Yeah. By faith, we persevere. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with you all. Amen.